The relentless summer sun beat down upon the courthouse steps in Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, 1883. Margaret Sullivan stood with her shoulders squared, her face a mask of stoic determination as she faced the crowd gathered to witness her humiliation. At 42, the widow's weathered features told of years spent battling the harsh frontier that had claimed her husband 3 years prior. Her calloused hands, now clenched into fists at her sides, had worked the Sullivan Cattle Ranch alone since Thomas's passing, fighting drought, rustlers, and now the territorial courts. Judge Franklin Pierce's words still rang in her ears. The court finds that a woman alone cannot maintain a property of this size and orders the immediate sale of the Sullivan Ranch to satisfy outstanding debts. What the judge failed to mention was that the buyer waiting eagerly in the wings was none other than Harold Blackwood, the railroad magnate whose tracks would run straight through her land once it belonged to him. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know what city you're watching from. The crowd parted as Margaret descended the courthouse steps, some offering sympathetic glances, while others averted their eyes. She had 30 days to vacate, 30 days to abandon the dream she and Thomas had built from nothing. The dusty main street of Willow Creek stretched before her, lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to mock her with their permanence as her own future crumbled. The distant mesas that had framed her life's work now seemed to be silent witnesses to her defeat. Sheriff Ethan Cooper approached cautiously, his weathered face creased with concern beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Margaret, I'm sorry about the ruling," he said, keeping his voice low. "Blackwood's got half the territory's officials in his pocket." Margaret's blue eyes, sharp as flint, met his. "This isn't over, Ethan," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "I've survived worse than Harold Blackwood." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, his fingers absently tracing the worn leather of his holster. "What are you planning, Margaret?" he asked, his voice tinged with wariness. "You can't fight the court's decision." A ghost of a smile touched Margaret's lips. "Watch me," she replied simply, before turning toward the livery stable where her bay mare waited. As she strode away, the whispers followed her like shadows, tales of her stubbornness, her refusal to accept a woman's place in this world. What none of them knew was that Margaret Sullivan had an ace up her sleeve, one that would shake Willow Creek to its foundations and test the limits of frontier justice. For beyond the boundaries of their small settlement, in the rugged foothills that marked the edge of Apache territory, dwelled a figure of such fearsome reputation that even hardened outlaws gave his domain wide berth. The mare's hooves kicked up dust as Margaret rode out of town, her mind racing faster than her horse. She had not survived 15 years on the frontier by surrendering to the first sign of trouble. Thomas had always said she had more spine than most men he knew. It was time to prove him right. The punishing heat shimmered across the landscape as Margaret left civilization behind, the familiar terrain of sage and mesquite gradually giving way to the rocky foothills. Few white settlers ventured this far, and for good reason. These lands belonged to Shadow Wolf, an aging Apache warrior whose name was whispered with fear in saloons across 3 territories. Rumors abounded about the man, that he had escaped the reservation years ago, that he had once been a scout for the army before some betrayal turned him against the white man, that he killed anyone who trespassed on his mountain. Most believed Shadow Wolf was merely a legend, a campfire tale to frighten children and greenhorns. But Margaret knew better. 5 years ago, during the worst drought in memory, when their cattle were dying and hope seemed lost, Thomas had ventured into these very foothills, desperate to find water. He never spoke of what happened there, but he returned changed, with knowledge of a hidden spring that saved their herd. And ever after, twice yearly, Thomas would ride out alone, carrying supplies, coffee, sugar, ammunition, leaving them at the base of a particular rock formation before returning home. After his death, Margaret had continued the tradition, honoring whatever pact her husband had made. She had never seen Shadow Wolf herself, but she had felt his presence, caught glimpses of movement in the rocks, found fresh deer meat at their doorstep during particularly harsh winters. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Margaret reached the familiar landmark, a tall rock spire that resembled a man pointing toward the sky. Here she dismounted, tethering her horse to a scraggly juniper. From her saddlebags, she withdrew the usual offerings, along with something new, a folded piece of paper containing a proposition that might either save her ranch or cost her her life. Placing the items at the base of the rock, Margaret stepped back and called out in a clear, strong voice, "I need to speak with you. My land, our land, is in danger." Only the wind answered her, whispering through the rocks and sparse vegetation. Margaret waited, the lengthening shadows bringing a chill that penetrated her riding jacket. As darkness began to fall, she reluctantly prepared to make camp, gathering wood for a small fire. The flames cast eerie shadows against the rock face as Margaret sipped from her canteen, her determination undiminished despite the growing cold. "I know you're there," she said to the darkness beyond the firelight. "I know you've been watching since I arrived. I wouldn't come if it wasn't important." A sound like loose gravel shifting caused her to turn sharply, hand instinctively moving to the revolver at her hip, and there he stood, as if materialized from the shadows themselves. Shadow Wolf was tall for an Apache, his frame lean but powerful despite his advancing years. His face was a map of lines and scars, framed by silver-streaked black hair tied back with a leather thong. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache garments and cast-off white man's clothing, and a Winchester rifle rested comfortably in his hands. Not aimed at her, but ready nonetheless. "Thomas Sullivan's woman," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "You continue his offerings." Margaret nodded, keeping her movements slow and deliberate as she lowered her hand from her weapon. "I keep his promises," she replied steadily, "as he kept his to you." Something that might have been approval flickered in the old warrior's dark eyes, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Why do you come now?" he asked, remaining at the edge of the firelight. "Your paper speaks of danger." Margaret took a deep breath. "The white man's court has ordered me to give up our land that borders your territory. If I lose it, the railroad will come, bringing more settlers, soldiers. Your solitude will end." Shadow Wolf's expression remained impassive, but she sensed a tension in his shoulders, a slight tightening of his grip on the rifle. "How does this concern me?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Margaret met his gaze unflinchingly. "I propose a marriage," she said bluntly, "in name only. Under territorial law, as my husband, you would have legal claim to the ranch. No white man would challenge you for it. They fear you too much." A long silence followed her words, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant cry of a coyote. Shadow Wolf's face revealed nothing, but his eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. Finally, he spoke, You would tie yourself to a man your people call savage? A man with the blood of settlers on his hands? Margaret's chin lifted slightly. I would tie myself to the man who saved my husband's life, who has watched over our ranch from afar. I need 3 months, time enough to prove the ranch can be profitable and challenge the court's decision. Shadow Wolf moved then, circling the fire to stand before her, close enough that she could see the web of scars across his weather-beaten face, the depth of wisdom and pain in his eyes. Your people will shun you, he warned. This decision cannot be unmade. Margaret stood her ground. My people already pity me, a woman alone fighting a battle they believe I cannot win. I prefer their fear to their pity. A sound emerged from Shadow Wolf's throat, something between a grunt and a chuckle. Thomas Sullivan chose well when he took you as wife, he said. I will consider your proposal. Return to your ranch. You will have my answer when the moon is full. With those words, he melted back into the darkness, leaving Margaret alone with the fire and her thoughts. Uncertainty and hope warring within her heart as she prepared to spend a restless night beneath the desert stars. 3 days later, Margaret stood in her kitchen, kneading bread dough with more force than necessary, flour dusting her apron and forearms. The windows were open to catch what little breeze stirred in the oppressive afternoon heat. From outside came the familiar sounds of ranch life, cattle lowing in the distance, chickens clucking in the yard, her ranch hand Billy Jenkins splitting wood by the barn. At 19, Billy was the only help she could afford to keep after Thomas's death, a gangly orphan with a good heart and strong back, who worked for room, board, and what little cash she could spare. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke her concentration. Wiping her hands on her apron, Margaret moved to the window, squinting against the sunlight to identify her visitor. Sheriff Cooper sat atop his dun gelding, his expression grim beneath the shadow of his hat. "Afternoon, Margaret," he called as he dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Margaret stepped onto the porch, wiping a stray lock of brown hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Just baking, Ethan. What brings you all the way out here?" The sheriff removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "It's Blackwood," he said without preamble. "He's trying to move up the transfer date. Says he needs to start surveying for the railroad before the fall rains." Anger flashed across Margaret's features. "He can't do that. The judge gave me 30 days. Sheriff Cooper's discomfort was evident as he shifted his weight. "He's got Judge Pierce's ear, Margaret. I thought you should know. They're meeting tomorrow to discuss it. Might be worth your while to be in town. Make your case directly." Margaret's mind raced. She hadn't expected to need Shadow Wolf's answer so soon. "Thank you for the warning, Ethan," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I'll be there." The sheriff nodded, replacing his hat. "There's something else," he said hesitantly. "Rumor has it you've been seen riding out toward Apache territory. People are talking, Margaret, saying you might be desperate enough to do something foolish." Margaret's eyes narrowed. And who might be spreading such rumors? Harold Blackwood's men, perhaps? The sheriff had the grace to look embarrassed. "Just be careful, Margaret. These are dangerous times. Wouldn't want to see you get hurt." As Sheriff Cooper rode away, Margaret leaned against the porch post, her mind made up. She couldn't wait for the full moon. She needed Shadow Wolf's answer now. That evening, after instructing Billy to watch the ranch, Margaret once again rode toward the foothills. The journey felt longer this time, each hoofbeat marking the passage of precious time slipping through her fingers. The sun was already setting when she reached the rock spire, painting the landscape in dramatic hues of orange and purple. Not bothering with offerings this time, Margaret called out immediately, "Shadow Wolf, I need to speak with you urgently." Silence greeted her words. Margaret dismounted, pacing anxiously. "Keys," she called again. "Blackwood is moving faster than expected. I need your answer." The twilight deepened around her, stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. Just as despair began to creep into her heart, a voice spoke from directly behind her, causing her to whirl around in alarm. "The answer is yes." Shadow Wolf stood barely 3 feet away, his ability to move silently still unnerving despite her having expected his appearance. "You have saved my life in the past, though you do not know it," he continued, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. "The meat left at your door during blizzards was repayment for medicine your husband brought when fever nearly took me to the spirit world." Margaret's surprise must have shown on her face, for Shadow Wolf's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Thomas Sullivan was an honorable man. He spoke often of his strong wife, said you were like the mountain lion, fierce in protection of what is yours. Margaret felt a pang of grief and pride at these words, a rare glimpse into how her husband had seen her. "We must go to your town tomorrow," Shadow Wolf continued. "The marriage must be witnessed by your lawkeepers." Margaret hesitated. "Are you certain? Once we do this, there's no turning back. The people of Willow Creek—" Shadow Wolf raised a hand, silencing her. "I have lived alone for many winters. Perhaps it is time to make the white man's law work against him, as he has used it against my people." His expression hardened. "And I have not forgotten what the railroad did to Apache lands further north. This Blackwood, he is the same kind of man." Margaret nodded, relief and anxiety mingling within her. "We should leave at first light," she said. "Reach town by mid-morning when the judge will be hearing cases." Shadow Wolf inclined his head in agreement. "I will find you here when the sun rises." As he turned to go, Margaret called after him, "Thank you." He paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "Do not thank me yet, Margaret Sullivan. Tomorrow we make many enemies." The new day dawned clear and bright, the sky a perfect blue canvas, stretched over the rugged landscape. Margaret had spent an uneasy night beneath her blanket, sleep coming in fitful bursts between long periods of staring at the star-filled sky. Wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life, or its most brilliant maneuver. True to his word, Shadow Wolf appeared as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern horizon. He had made concessions to the occasion, wearing a clean if worn white man's shirt beneath his fringed leather vest, his long hair tied back neatly. The Winchester was still his companion, along with a knife at his belt and what looked like an army Colt in a holster partially hidden by his vest. "You have doubts," he said. Not a question, but a statement as he approached. Margaret mounted her horse, adjusting her riding skirt. "No doubts about what needs to be done," she replied, "only about what comes after." Shadow Wolf swung effortlessly onto the back of a paint horse that she hadn't noticed until now, the animal appearing as if conjured from the landscape itself. "After is for tomorrow," he said simply. "Today we fight." They rode side by side down from the foothills, an unlikely pair making their way across the open country toward Willow Creek. Little was said between them, but the silence was not uncomfortable. Margaret found herself studying her companion when she thought he wasn't looking. This legendary figure, who had haunted frontier stories for years, now riding beside her in the flesh. Despite his age, she guessed him to be in his 6th decade at least. He sat his horse with a straight back and watchful eyes that missed nothing. Willow Creek came into view just before 10 o'clock, the morning stage having already arrived, judging by the activity around the station. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as they approached the outskirts of town. "People will stare," she warned. "Some may be hostile." Shadow Wolf's expression remained impassive. "I have faced worse than stares," he replied. And with those words, they crossed the invisible boundary between wilderness and civilization, their horses' hooves raising dust from the main street as they rode into town. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A woman hanging laundry dropped her basket with a shriek. 2 cowboys, emerging from the saloon, froze mid-step, hands instinctively moving toward their sidearms. A shopkeeper ushering a customer inside slammed his door shut with a bang that echoed down the street. The whispers spread like wildfire ahead of them. "It's Shadow Wolf, the Apache killer. Margaret Sullivan's brought him to town." By the time they reached the courthouse, a crowd had begun to gather, people emerging from businesses and homes to witness the spectacle. Margaret dismounted with practiced ease, tying her horse to the hitching rail. Shadow Wolf followed suit, his movements fluid and unhurried despite the growing tension in the air. Sheriff Cooper pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his holster, his expression a mixture of shock and concern. "Margaret, what in God's name are you doing?" he hissed as he reached them. Before she could answer, the courthouse doors swung open, and Judge Pierce emerged, followed closely by Harold Blackwood and several other men in expensive suits. "Railroad investors," Margaret presumed. The judge stopped dead in his tracks, his florid face paling at the sight before him. Blackwood, a tall man with a carefully trimmed beard and cold eyes, stepped forward. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his gaze flicking between Margaret and Shadow Wolf. "Is this some kind of threat, Mrs. Sullivan?" Margaret straightened her spine, meeting his gaze squarely. "Not at all, Mr. Blackwood. I've come to inform Judge Pierce that there's been a development regarding my ranch." She turned to the judge, whose hand trembled slightly as he gripped the railing of the courthouse steps. "Your Honor, I wish to register a marriage. This is my husband now, and under territorial law, he has legal claim to the Sullivan Ranch alongside me." A stunned silence fell over the crowd, broken only by scattered gasps and muttered exclamations. Judge Pierce found his voice first, his tone incredulous. "You cannot be serious, Mrs. Sullivan. This man is an Apache, a wanted man." Shadow Wolf spoke then, his deep voice carrying easily across the hushed gathering. "I am Chiricahua Apache, yes, but I have never been charged with any crime by your courts. I was a scout for the Army at Fort Bowie before I chose to live alone." The judge sputtered, his face reddening. "This is preposterous. I will not recognize such a union. It's clearly a desperate attempt to circumvent the court's ruling." Margaret's voice cut through his bluster, sharp as a knife. "On what grounds, Your Honor?" "There is no law in this territory prohibiting marriage between whites and Indians. You yourself performed the ceremony for John Yellowbird and Mary Connolly last spring." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people recognized the truth in her words. Blackwood stepped forward, his voice silky with barely contained fury. "Judge Pierce, surely you won't allow this farce to proceed. This woman is making a mockery of the court." The judge's eyes darted nervously between Blackwood's cold stare and Shadow Wolf's impassive face. Sheriff Cooper cleared his throat. She's right about the law, Judge. There's no legal grounds to refuse. A vein pulsed visibly at Blackwood's temple as he turned to Margaret. Do you understand what you're doing? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. You'll be an outcast. No decent person will associate with a woman who lies with an apache. Margaret didn't flinch. I'm not concerned with your definition of decency, Mr. Blackwood. I'm concerned with justice and keeping what rightfully belongs to me. Judge Pierce, seeing no easy way out, finally nodded reluctantly. Very well. If you insist on this course of action, the ceremony can be performed. But be warned, Mrs. Sullivan, this changes nothing about your ability to maintain the property. If you fail to make it profitable within the time frame set by this court, it will still be sold. Margaret inclined her head. I understand, Your Honor. The judge turned on his heel and stalked back into the courthouse, followed by a fuming Blackwood. The rest of the crowd remained, watching in fascinated horror as Margaret Sullivan and the infamous Shadow Wolf climbed the steps to follow, about to formalize the most shocking union Willow Creek had ever witnessed. The ceremony itself was brief and coldly formal, Judge Pierce rushing through the words as if they left a bad taste in his mouth. Shadow Wolf remained stoic throughout, responding at the appropriate moments with a dignity that seemed to unnerve the judge even further. When it was done, Margaret Sullivan, now legally Margaret Wolf, signed the marriage certificate with a steady hand. Shadow Wolf made his mark beside her signature, a symbol that looked like a wolf's paw print. Sheriff Cooper and the reluctant court clerk served as witnesses. As they emerged from the courthouse into the bright sunlight, the crowd had grown even larger, word having spread throughout Willow Creek. Margaret spotted Billy Jenkins at the edge of the gathering, his young face a picture of confusion and concern. She would have explaining to do when they returned to the ranch. Blackwood intercepted them at the bottom of the steps, his companions flanking him like a small army of tailored suits and polished boots. This isn't over, Mrs. Sullivan, or whatever you call yourself now, he said, his voice pitched low enough that only Margaret and Shadow Wolf could hear. You think you've been clever, but you've only delayed the inevitable. Shadow Wolf moved slightly, positioning himself between Margaret and Blackwood in a subtle but unmistakable gesture of protection. The woman has made her choice, he said calmly. The law you white men worship has recognized it. Go build your iron road elsewhere. Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. You don't want me as an enemy, Apache. Shadow Wolf met his gaze unflinchingly. I have faced worse enemies than a man who hides behind papers and bought judges. Blackwood's hand twitched as if reaching for a weapon, but a warning look from Sheriff Cooper stayed his motion. With a final glare, he turned and stalked away, his entourage following in his wake. Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That man won't give up easily, she murmured. Shadow Wolf nodded. Men like him never do. We must be vigilant. They made their way to their horses through the parted crowd, the whispers following them like persistent shadows. Margaret caught fragments. Disgrace, savage, mad widow, but held her head high, refusing to show how the words stung. As they mounted and prepared to leave town, Billy Jenkins approached hesitantly. Mrs. Sullivan, should I come back to the ranch? Margaret looked down at the young man who had stood by her through the hardest years. Of course, Billy. Nothing's changed, except we now have better legal standing. She glanced at Shadow Wolf, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. And we may need extra eyes watching our backs in the days to come. Relief flooded Billy's freckled face. Yes, ma'am. I'll follow along shortly. As they rode out of Willow Creek, Margaret could feel the weight of every stare. the judgment in every silence. She had known it would be this way, had prepared herself for it. But the reality was still a heavy burden to bear. "They will not forget this day," Shadow Wolf said quietly as the town receded behind them. "Nor will Blackwood. The real battle begins now." The journey back to the ranch was tense. Oath riders alert for any sign of pursuit or ambush. None came. But Margaret harbored no illusions that Blackwood would accept defeat so easily. As they crested the final rise overlooking the Sullivan Ranch, their ranch now, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the modest house, barn, and corrals. Cattle dotted the pastures, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney, where Margaret had left the stove burning low that morning. "It's not much," she said, suddenly self-conscious about what Shadow Wolf might think of the place he was now legally tied to. "But it's good land, with reliable water, thanks to the spring you showed Thomas." Shadow Wolf surveyed the property with keen eyes. "You have built well here," he said after a moment. "The land remembers those who respect it." They rode down to the ranch house in companionable silence. As they dismounted, Margaret's mind turned to practical matters. "There's a small cabin near the north pasture," she said, unsaddling her mare. "Thomas built it for the seasonal hands we used to hire during calving. It's basic but sound. I thought, that is, it would be yours if you wished it." Shadow Wolf nodded, understanding her unspoken message. This was a marriage of convenience, nothing more. "It will serve," he replied simply, removing his own saddle with practiced ease. "But first, we should discuss what Blackwood will do next. He is not a man to surrender what he wants." Margaret led the way to the house, her mind racing with the implications of everything that had transpired. This strange alliance was just beginning, and she had no illusions about the challenges that lay ahead. Inside the ranch house, Margaret busied herself making coffee, the familiar routine helping to settle her nerves. Shadow Wolf stood just inside the door, his tall frame seeming too large for the modest kitchen with its worn wooden table and cast-iron stove. "Sit, please," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair. "The coffee will be ready soon." Shadow Wolf hesitated, then moved to the offered seat, placing his Winchester within easy reach against the table. "Your young ranch hand," he said as Margaret set cups on the table. "He is loyal?" Margaret nodded, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "Billy's a good boy. His parents died in a cholera outbreak when he was 14. Thomas hired him out of charity at first, but he's proven himself a hard worker. He's been like family these past few years." Shadow Wolf absorbed this information with a thoughtful expression. "And he can be trusted with what we have done?" Margaret set the coffee pot on the stove before turning to face her new husband. "Billy may be young, but he understands survival. He knows this ranch is his home too." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I should explain our arrangement to him. He'll have questions." Shadow Wolf inclined his head in agreement. "Tell him what you must. But remember, Blackwood will have ears everywhere. What is known by one may soon be known by all." The coffee began to bubble on the stove, its rich aroma filling the kitchen. Outside, they heard the approach of a horse, Billy returning from town, no doubt with fresh tales of the scandal they had created. Margaret poured the coffee into 2 cups, setting one before Shadow Wolf. "Blackwood will try to discredit us," she said, taking her own seat across from him. "He'll claim the marriage is a fraud, meant only to circumvent the court's ruling." Shadow Wolf wrapped his weathered hands around the cup, the steam rising between them. "It is a fraud," he pointed out, his dark eyes meeting hers directly, "but one made necessary by unjust circumstances." Margaret couldn't help but smile slightly. "Yes, But we're the only ones who need to know that. She took a sip of her coffee, considering their next move. We have 3 months to prove the ranch can be profitable. We'll need to increase the herd, perhaps sell some of the yearlings early to show income. Shadow Wolf listened intently, his expression thoughtful. The drought to the south has made water scarce, he said after a moment. Ranchers there may pay well for healthy cattle that don't need to be driven far. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. You know about the cattle markets? Shadow Wolf's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. I've watched white men's ways for many years. Knowledge is survival. Before Margaret could respond, the kitchen door opened, and Billy entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. The young man's eyes darted nervously between Margaret and Shadow Wolf, his discomfort evident in the way he twisted his hat brim in his hands. Mrs. Sullivan, or I guess it's Mrs. Wolf now? He ventured uncertainly. Margaret is fine, Billy. You know that, she replied, gesturing for him to join them. This is Shadow Wolf. He's… Well, as you heard in town, we're married now. Billy nodded, still standing awkwardly by the door. Yes, ma'am. Whole town's talking about nothing else. His gaze shifted to Shadow Wolf, a mixture of fear and curiosity in his young eyes. Sir, I've heard stories about you since I was a boy. Shadow Wolf regarded the youth steadily. Most are false, he said simply. Some are true. Judge me by what you see, not what you hear. Billy swallowed visibly but nodded again. Yes, sir. Margaret poured a third cup of coffee, setting it on the table. Sit, Billy. We have plans to discuss. This ranch is going to survive, and we'll all need to work together to make that happen. As the unlikely trio gathered around the kitchen table, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the Sullivan Ranch. In Willow Creek, whispers and speculation ran wild about the widow who had defied convention and the court by claiming the feared Apache warrior as her husband. And in his plush hotel room, Harold Blackwood paced like a caged predator, already plotting his next move against the woman who had dared to challenge his will. The battle for the Sullivan Ranch, and perhaps for something more, had only just begun. But for the first time since the judge's ruling, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. With Shadow Wolf's unexpected alliance, she had gained not just legal standing, but a partner whose reputation alone might give even Blackwood pause. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in this moment of fragile peace, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually win. The days following the shocking marriage settled into an uneasy rhythm at the Sullivan Ranch. Shadow Wolf had indeed taken residence in the North Pasture cabin, riding out each dawn and returning at dusk. His activities during the day, a mystery that Margaret didn't press him to explain. True to her prediction, Blackwood wasted no time in challenging the validity of their union. 3 days after the ceremony, Sheriff Cooper rode out with papers demanding they appear before Judge Pierce again. This time, to prove the marriage was not entered into fraudulently. Margaret had anticipated this move and was prepared with a counter-strategy when she and Shadow Wolf rode into town the following day. The stares and whispers continued, but now with an edge of fascination mingled with the previous disgust and fear. In the courtroom, Blackwood's lawyer, a slick-talking man named Preston from San Francisco, argued vehemently that the marriage was clearly a sham designed solely to circumvent the court's previous ruling. Your Honor, he proclaimed, pacing before the bench with theatrical gravity, no woman in her right mind would willingly bind herself to a man with such a Notorious background, unless coerced or driven by desperation. We contend that Mrs. Sullivan has made a mockery of the institution of marriage and the authority of this court. Judge Pierce, still visibly uncomfortable with the whole situation, turned to Margaret. Mrs. Wolfe, how do you respond to these serious allegations? Margaret rose, her head held high despite the hostile murmurs from Blackwood's supporters, who filled half the courtroom. Your Honor, the law does not require me to justify my choice of husband to Mr. Blackwood or anyone else, she stated firmly. Many marriages on the frontier are made for practical considerations: protection, survival, the joining of properties or skills. Mine is no different. She paused, looking directly at Blackwood. What truly concerns Mr. Blackwood is not the sanctity of marriage, but his thwarted attempt to seize land that has been in my family for 15 years. Land that suddenly became valuable only when his railroad decided to cut through it. Shadow Wolf sat silently beside her, his presence alone a challenge to the proceedings. When Preston demanded to know if they were living as man and wife, Shadow Wolf finally spoke, his deep voice silencing the courtroom. Among my people, a man provides for his wife, protects her, respects her home and her work. By these measures, yes, we live as husband and wife. Judge Pierce, finding no clear legal grounds to invalidate the marriage without setting a dangerous precedent for other frontier unions, reluctantly dismissed Blackwood's petition. However, he added, fixing Margaret with a stern gaze, the court's original concerns about the viability of the ranch remain. You still must demonstrate its profitability within the prescribed 3 months. As they left the courthouse, Blackwood intercepted them, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Enjoy your victory while it lasts, he said in a low voice. There are many ways to skin a cat or a wolf. Shadow Wolf stepped forward, placing himself between Margaret and the railroad man. Threats are the weapons of a weak man, he said calmly. Be careful how you use them. Something in his tone made even Blackwood step back slightly before turning away with a contemptuous snort. Back at the ranch that evening, Margaret sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mesas in shades of gold and crimson. The confrontation in town had left her drained but determined. Shadow Wolf emerged from the barn where he had been helping Billy repair a broken wagon wheel. He approached the porch, moving with his characteristic silent grace. Blackwood will not rely on the law next time, he said without preamble, leaning against the porch post. Margaret nodded, offering him a cup of the coffee she had brought outside. I know, she replied. I've been thinking about what he might try. Rustlers taking our cattle would be the easiest way to ensure we can't show a profit. Shadow Wolf accepted the cup, his fingers briefly brushing hers in a rare moment of contact. I have already begun watching the boundaries, he said, and I have friends still among the Apache who owe me favors. They will help guard the herd. Margaret looked at him with surprise. You've asked others to help us? Shadow Wolf's expression remained impassive as he sipped his coffee. This fight is not just yours anymore, he said simply. When I gave my word before your judge, it became mine as well. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the day's last light fade from the sky. After a while, Margaret spoke again, her voice thoughtful. Why did you really agree to this arrangement? It can't just be about keeping Blackwood from building his railroad. Shadow Wolf was quiet for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. Finally, he turned to face her, his weathered features softened by the gathering dusk. When I was a young man, Before the wars with your people began in earnest, I had a wife, a son. They died of the white man's diseases, brought by settlers. Margaret's breath caught at this unexpected glimpse into his past. I'm sorry, she said softly. Shadow Wolf's gaze turned distant, focused on memories only he could see. For many years after, I fought your people with hate in my heart. I killed many, soldiers, settlers, anyone who came into our lands. Then I grew tired of death. When the army offered peace if I would scout for them, I accepted. But they betrayed that peace, forced my people onto the reservation where many more died. His hand tightened around the coffee cup. I escaped, chose to live alone in the mountains, rather than die slowly on their reservation. Your husband was the first white man in many years I did not try to kill on sight. His honesty reminded me of a time before hate. He looked at her directly. Perhaps helping you is a way to honor that memory. Margaret was silent for a moment, absorbing this revelation. Thank you for telling me, she said finally, and for helping me fight for this land. Shadow Wolf nodded once, then straightened. Tomorrow we should ride the south boundary, he said, his tone shifting back to practicality. I saw signs of riders there yesterday, not your usual ranch hands. Margaret set her empty cup aside. Blackwood's men already? That didn't take long. Shadow Wolf's expression hardened. They will learn that this wolf still has teeth. With those words, he turned and walked away toward his cabin, his silhouette merging with the darkness beyond the ranch house. Margaret remained on the porch a while longer, contemplating the strange turn her life had taken and the unlikely alliance that now represented her best hope of saving everything she had worked for. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity to the Sullivan Ranch. True to Shadow Wolf's prediction, Blackwood's tactics quickly shifted from legal challenges to more direct methods of harassment. First came reports from neighboring ranchers that Margaret's cattle had broken through fences onto their land, claims she knew to be false, as Shadow Wolf and Billy rode the boundaries daily, finding no breaks. Then a small brush fire mysteriously started near the eastern pasture during a particularly dry spell, though fortunately they managed to contain it before significant damage occurred. Most concerning were the strangers who began appearing on the outskirts of the property, rough-looking men who claimed to be prospectors or travelers, but whose eyes lingered too long on the ranch house, the cattle, the comings and goings of its residents. Shadow Wolf proved invaluable during this time, his tracking skills and knowledge of the terrain allowing them to anticipate and counter many of Blackwood's moves. Margaret found herself increasingly relying on his counsel, their initially awkward partnership gradually evolving into something approaching genuine respect and collaboration. She learned that beneath his stoic exterior lay a sharp mind and dry wit that occasionally surfaced in unexpected moments. For his part, Shadow Wolf seemed to adapt to ranch life with surprising ease, his innate understanding of the land and animals making him a natural cattleman despite his different cultural background. The arrangement remained strictly business, he in his cabin, she in the main house. But the boundaries between them began to soften as they faced common enemies together. Billy Jenkins, after initial wariness, had grown to admire Shadow Wolf, eagerly absorbing the Apache's teachings about tracking, hunting, and reading the subtle signs of the natural world. One evening, Margaret watched from the kitchen window as Shadow Wolf showed the boy how to move silently through the underbrush near the creek. The unlikely teacher and student silhouetted against the setting sun. The scene brought an unexpected lump to her throat. Thomas would have approved of this strange education, she thought. He had always believed in learning from every source, regardless of origin. The thought of her late husband no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, a worn nostalgia took its place. Memories of their life together, coexisting peacefully with her current reality. The first real test of their new alliance came approximately 1 month after the marriage. Margaret was awakened in the dead of night by Shadow Wolf's hand over her mouth, his figure a darker shadow in the darkness of her bedroom. "Rustlers," he whispered as she startled awake. "At least 6 men in the south pasture. Get dressed." Heart pounding, Margaret nodded, and he removed his hand, disappearing as silently as he had entered. She dressed quickly in riding clothes, strapping on her revolver before hurrying outside. Shadow Wolf and Billy were waiting by the barn, horses already saddled. "How many cattle are they after?" she asked in a hushed voice as she mounted her mare. Shadow Wolf checked his Winchester before replying. "They've gathered about 30 head, moving them toward the ravine. Blackwood's men, wearing bandanas to hide their faces, but I recognized 2 from town." The 3 riders set out at a canter, keeping to the shadows cast by the 3/4 moon. Shadow Wolf led them on a circuitous route that brought them ahead of the rustlers' likely path. "We'll intercept them at the narrow pass," he explained as they dismounted in a copse of cottonwoods. "They must bring the cattle through here to reach the old mine road." Margaret checked her revolver, trying to control her racing pulse. "What's the plan?" she asked. Shadow Wolf's expression was grim in the moonlight. "Billy will stay with the horses. You and I will position ourselves on either side of the pass. When they reach the center, we fire warning shots. Most will run rather than fight when surprised." Margaret nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her. These men worked for Blackwood. They might be more determined than ordinary rustlers. They didn't have to wait long. The sound of lowing cattle and the occasional shout from the rustlers grew steadily closer. Margaret crouched behind a large boulder, watching the entrance to the pass. Shadow Wolf had vanished into the rocks on the opposite side, invisible even to her eyes that had adjusted to the darkness. The cattle appeared first, hesitant and balking at being driven in the night. Behind them rode 6 men, just as Shadow Wolf had counted, their faces obscured by bandanas pulled up over their noses. Margaret recognized the build and distinctive hat of one of them, Sam Hollis, a drifter who had been hanging around Willow Creek for weeks, rumored to be on Blackwood's payroll. Her finger tensed on the trigger as she waited for Shadow Wolf's signal. A single shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. Margaret fired her own warning shot a split second later. The effect was immediate. The cattle spooked, several breaking away from the herd in panic. 5 of the rustlers reined in hard, their horses rearing and spinning in confusion. But Hollis, in the lead, drew his revolver and fired blindly toward the source of Shadow Wolf's shot. "It's the Apache and the woman," he shouted to his companions. "Blackwood's paying extra for their heads." A second rustler drew his weapon, but before he could fire, Shadow Wolf's rifle cracked again, and the man dropped from his saddle with a cry of pain. This was enough for 3 of the remaining rustlers, who wheeled their horses and fled back the way they had come. But Hollis and 1 other man split up, seeking cover among the rocks, clearly intent on fighting. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed herself against the boulder. A bullet struck the rock, inches from her head, sending fragments flying. She heard movement to her right and turned to see Hollis working his way around her position. Taking a deep breath, She rolled to a better vantage point and fired twice in rapid succession. Hollis cursed as one of her bullets found its mark, grazing his arm. From across the pass came more gunfire as Shadow Wolf exchanged shots with the other rustler. The night air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the frightened bellows of the scattered cattle. Margaret was preparing to fire again when a new sound cut through the chaos, a war cry that raised the hair on the back of her neck, followed by the thunder of approaching hooves. 3 riders burst into the pass, silhouetted against the moonlight, their whooping calls unmistakably Apache. They rode straight at the rustlers' positions, firing rifles from horseback with deadly accuracy. Hollis broke cover, running for his horse in panic. Margaret had a clear shot, but held her fire, unwilling to shoot a man in the back, no matter his crimes. The remaining rustler wasn't so fortunate. He rose to flee and was cut down by one of the Apache riders. Within moments, it was over. The rustlers who had fled were long gone. Hollis was racing away as fast as his horse could carry him. And the pass held only Margaret, Shadow Wolf, the 3 Apache riders, and 1 dead rustler. Billy emerged cautiously from the trees, leading their horses, his young face pale but composed in the moonlight. Shadow Wolf stepped into the open, exchanging words in the Apache language with the 3 riders. Margaret approached slowly, her revolver lowered, but still in hand. Shadow Wolf turned to her. "These are friends I spoke of. They have been watching other parts of our boundaries." He introduced them by their Apache names: Running Elk, Two Hawks, and Stonecutter. The men nodded respectfully to Margaret, their expressions revealing nothing of what they thought about this white woman, their former chief, now called wife. "They will help us gather the scattered cattle," Shadow Wolf continued. "By morning, we will have the herd intact again." Margaret holstered her weapon, nodding gratefully to the Apache riders. "Thank you," she said simply. "You arrived at exactly the right moment." As dawn broke over the Sullivan Ranch, the last of the scattered cattle were being herded back to their pasture. Margaret, exhausted but relieved, dismounted by the barn, where Billy was already unsaddling his horse. Shadow Wolf and his Apache friends conversed quietly nearby, their discussion punctuated by occasional gestures toward the distant hills. "Will they stay?" Margaret asked Billy, nodding toward the Apache men. The young ranch hand shrugged. "Shadow Wolf asked them to help patrol the boundaries for a while. Said Blackwood won't stop with one attempt." Margaret sighed, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension of the long night. He's right about that. This was just the beginning. She watched as the Apache riders mounted up, exchanging final words with Shadow Wolf before riding off toward the hills, presumably to set up the patrols he had requested. Shadow Wolf approached her, his face showing the same weariness she felt, though his movements remained fluid and purposeful. "We should report this to your sheriff," he said without preamble. "The dead man is evidence of Blackwood's methods." Margaret nodded, though her stomach knotted at the thought of returning to town so soon after the previous confrontation. "We'll go after we've had some rest," she agreed. "Though I doubt it'll change much. Blackwood has too many friends in high places." Shadow Wolf's dark eyes met hers, a fierce determination evident in their depths. "Perhaps. But your white man's law works on evidence and witnesses. We now have both." As she looked up at him, Margaret realized with a start that something had shifted between them during the night's events. The awkward alliance of convenience had been tempered by shared danger into something stronger, a partnership based on mutual respect and trust. Later that day, after a few hours of much-needed sleep, Margaret and Shadow Wolf rode into Willow Creek with the body of the fallen rustler slung over a pack horse. The town's reaction to their approach was noticeably different this time. Less open hostility, more wary curiosity. Word of the attempted cattle rustling had already reached town, carried by the surviving rustlers who had fled. As they made their way to the sheriff's office, Margaret noticed people watching from windows and doorways, their expressions unreadable. Sheriff Cooper met them outside his office, his face grim as he eyed the body. "Heard there was trouble out at your place last night," he said, helping them unload the dead man. "This one of Blackwood's men?" Margaret nodded. Sam Hollis was leading them. He got away with a bullet grazed to his arm. This one wasn't so lucky. The sheriff examined the body, noting the fatal wound. "Apache arrow," he observed, looking up at Shadow Wolf with raised eyebrows. "I had friends watching the boundaries," Shadow Wolf replied evenly. "They help defend what is ours, by your law." Cooper sighed heavily. "This complicates things, Margaret. Blackwood's already been to see Judge Pierce, claiming you and your husband are harboring hostile Indians, putting the whole territory at risk." Margaret's temper flared. "That's rich, coming from the man who sent armed rustlers to steal our cattle. Sheriff, you know as well as I do that Blackwood is behind this. We have a witness. One of the rustlers who survived admitted Hollis said Blackwood was paying them." Cooper ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "Hollis is denying everything, claiming he was nowhere near your ranch last night, and Blackwood has 3 men swearing he was playing poker with them until dawn." Margaret's frustration mounted. "So that's it? He can send men to steal our cattle, maybe even kill us, and face no consequences?" The sheriff looked genuinely apologetic. "I don't like it any more than you do, Margaret. But without Hollis's confession, it's just your word against theirs." Shadow Wolf, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "The dead speak their own truth," he said, pointing to the rustler's body. "This man worked at Blackwood's camp for 2 weeks. His boots will match tracks left at your last cattle raid. His horse bears Blackwood's ranch brand." Cooper blinked, clearly surprised by this detailed observation. "I'll look into it," he promised. "But don't expect miracles. Blackwood has Judge Pierce and half the territorial officials in his pocket." As they left the sheriff's office, Margaret felt a mix of determination and despair. "We're fighting an uphill battle," she said quietly as they walked toward their horses. Shadow Wolf nodded, his expression somber. "Yes, but not all battles are won by strength alone. Sometimes the smaller force prevails through persistence, knowledge of the land, unexpected alliances." He paused, looking down the main street toward the hotel where Blackwood was staying. "Your enemy believes himself untouchable because of his money and connections. Such men grow careless, make mistakes." Margaret followed his gaze, a new resolve forming within her. "You're right, and we have something Blackwood doesn't. Nothing left to lose." Shadow Wolf's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "That makes us dangerous," he agreed. "More dangerous than he knows." The ride back to the ranch was spent in thoughtful discussion, planning their next moves in what was rapidly becoming a war for survival. Margaret found herself drawing on Shadow Wolf's strategic thinking, honed through years of conflict and survival against overwhelming odds. Together, they began to formulate a different approach, one that wouldn't rely on Sheriff Cooper or Judge Pierce for justice, but would instead use Blackwood's own tactics against him. As the Sullivan Ranch came into view, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. This land, her land, their land now, was worth fighting for by whatever means necessary. And in Shadow Wolf, she had found not just a legal shield, but a true ally whose wisdom and strength complemented her own determination. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Margaret could envision a path to victory, however narrow and fraught with danger it might be. 2 months had passed since the courthouse confrontation, with only 1 month remaining before Judge Pierce's deadline. The attempted cattle rustling had been just the first of Blackwood's efforts to undermine the Sullivan Ranch's profitability. Water rights suddenly came into question when a neighbor claimed the creek feeding their southern pastures ran primarily through his property. Suppliers in town mysteriously found themselves unable to fulfill orders for essential ranch supplies. When Margaret arranged to sell a portion of their herd to a buyer from Tucson, the man abruptly canceled the deal after a private meeting with Blackwood's representatives. Yet, despite these setbacks, the ranch had not only survived, but begun to thrive under the unlikely partnership of Margaret Sullivan and Shadow Wolf. The Apache's knowledge of the land had proven invaluable, allowing them to develop new water sources when access to the creek was restricted. His hunting skills supplemented their food stores, reducing expenses. Most significantly, his connections among the scattered Apache who still lived freely in the hills provided both protection and unexpected commercial opportunities. Through these contacts, Shadow Wolf arranged for the sale of 20 head of cattle to the cavalry at Fort Grant, who were struggling to feed their troops due to supply problems further east. The Army quartermaster, more concerned with feeding his men than with local politics, was happy to purchase quality beef without asking too many questions about its source. This transaction alone had brought in enough money to cover the ranch's outstanding debts and show a modest profit. More subtle, but equally important, was the gradual shift in how Willow Creek's residents viewed the unusual couple. The initial shock and scandal had given way to a reluctant admiration in some quarters, particularly among those who had their own reasons to resent Blackwood's growing influence. When Margaret and Shadow Wolf now rode into town for supplies, they still drew stares, but also received occasional nods of acknowledgement or quiet words of support. Illy Jenkins reported that conversations in the saloon had shifted from condemnation of the Mad Widow and her savage to speculation about whether they might actually succeed in their defiance of Blackwood. Even Sheriff Cooper, bound by his official position to remain neutral, had begun passing along useful information about Blackwood's movements and plans when their paths crossed. On a warm evening in late September, with the deadline just 3 weeks away, Margaret sat at the kitchen table reviewing their financial records. The numbers told a story that even Judge Pierce would find difficult to dismiss. The Sullivan Ranch was solvent, with modest but clear profits for 2 consecutive months. Shadow Wolf entered without knocking, a habit Margaret had grown accustomed to, carrying a brace of rabbits for the evening meal. "How do we stand?" he asked, setting his catch on the sideboard. Margaret looked up with a tired smile. "Better than I expected. If nothing changes, we'll have enough to satisfy the court's requirements." Shadow Wolf nodded, washing his hands in the basin. "Blackwood knows this too," he said. "He will make one final attempt, something larger than before." Margaret sighed, pushing away the ledger. "I know. I've been expecting it every day." She stood, moving to prepare the rabbits for cooking. Shadow Wolf watched her for a moment, then spoke in a tone more hesitant than his usual decisive manner. "There is something we should discuss." Margaret paused, knife in hand, struck by the unusual uncertainty in his voice. "What is it?" she asked. Shadow Wolf sat at the table, his weathered hands flat before him. When this is over, when you have won your case, what happens to our arrangement? The question caught Margaret off guard. In the heat of their battle with Blackwood, she had given little thought to what would come after. "I assumed you would want to return to your life in the hills," she said slowly. "That we would dissolve the marriage once it had served its purpose." Shadow Wolf was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "Is that what you want?" he asked finally. Margaret set down the knife, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his gaze. "I haven't allowed myself to think beyond survival," she admitted. "This marriage was a strategy, a means to an end. I never expected," she trailed off, unsure how to express the complicated feelings that had developed over their months together. Shadow Wolf rose, moving to stand near her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Nor did I," he said quietly. "But things change. People change." Margaret looked up then, searching his face for meaning behind the simple words. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, the sound of approaching riders broke the moment. Shadow Wolf moved swiftly to the window, his body instantly alert. "6 men," he reported, his tone shifting to businesslike efficiency. "Armed. Blackwood is with them." Margaret's heart raced as she grabbed her shotgun from its place by the door. "Billy's still out checking the north fence line," she said. "We're on our own." Shadow Wolf nodded, retrieving his Winchester. "Stay inside. I will speak to them first." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, we face this together. This is my ranch, our ranch now." After a brief hesitation, Shadow Wolf inclined his head in agreement. They moved to the porch, standing side by side as the riders approached, their weapons ready but not aimed. A show of preparation rather than aggression. Blackwood reined in his horse before the porch steps, his usual polished appearance somewhat diminished by trail dust. The men flanking him were clearly hired guns, their hands hovering near holstered weapons. "Mrs. Wolf," Blackwood called, a mocking emphasis on her married name. "I see your savage husband is at home as well." "How convenient." Margaret kept her voice level despite her racing pulse. "State your business, Mr. Blackwood. You're trespassing on private property." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I think we both know that's a temporary condition. Your little charade has been amusing, I'll grant you that. But the time for games is over." He gestured to one of his men, who produced an official-looking document. "Judge Pierce has issued a new ruling. In light of the ongoing disturbances, Indian attacks, gunfights, disruption of commerce, the court has determined that your ranch presents a danger to public safety." Margaret felt as though the ground had dropped from beneath her feet. "That's absurd. Any disturbances have been caused by your men attacking us." Blackwood shrugged, unconcerned with the truth. "The ruling stands. You have 48 hours to vacate the property, which will be held in trust until proper ownership can be determined." His smug expression left no doubt who would ultimately gain control. Shadow Wolf spoke then, his deep voice cutting through Margaret's shock. "The court has no jurisdiction over me. I am not bound by its paper declarations." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Don't test me, Apache. You may have scared some of my men with your Indian friends, but I have the territorial militia at my disposal now. Resist, and you'll find yourself back on the reservation, if you're lucky enough to survive the journey." Margaret's mind raced, searching for options, for any legal recourse against this blatant abuse of power. Shadow Wolf's steady presence beside her was the only thing keeping her from either collapsing or charging at Blackwood with her shotgun. "Why now?" she demanded. "Why not wait for the deadline we were given?" Blackwood adjusted his riding gloves with deliberate casualness. "Deadlines change, Mrs. Wolf. Progress waits for no one. The railroad survey team arrives next week, and we need to begin preparations immediately." His eyes narrowed. "Besides, I've grown tired of your defiance. Consider this a lesson in the realities of civilization." He tipped his hat with mocking courtesy. 48 hours. I suggest you use them wisely." With that, he wheeled his horse around, his men following as they rode away toward town. Margaret stood frozen until the riders disappeared from view, then sagged against the porch post, the shotgun suddenly heavy in her hands. "He's won," she whispered, a bitter taste filling her mouth. "After everything we've done, he's still won." Shadow Wolf set his Winchester aside, turning to face her fully. For the first time since she had known him, naked emotion showed in his dark eyes, not defeat, but a fierce, burning anger. "No," he said firmly, "he has not won while we still breathe. We have fought his men, his money, his corrupt officials. Now we fight with all we have left." Margaret looked up at him, drawn from her despair by the intensity of his conviction. "What can we possibly do against the territorial militia?" she asked. "They'll come with enough men to overwhelm even your Apache friends." Shadow Wolf took the shotgun from her hands, setting it aside before taking her shoulders in a gentle but firm grip. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, using her birth name deliberately. "You claimed me as husband when no other would dare. You have stood against threats and bullets without flinching. You are stronger than any woman, any person I have known." His thumbs traced small circles on her shoulders, the first deliberately tender gesture he had offered in their months together. "We will not surrender what is ours. Not to Blackwood, not to his judge, not to 100 militia." The fierce conviction in his voice kindled an answering fire in Margaret's heart, pushing back the cold tide of despair. "What do you propose?" she asked, straightening her spine. "We can't fight the entire territory." Shadow Wolf's expression shifted to one she had seen before when he was plotting strategy, focused, calculating, considering all angles. "We don't fight the territory," he said. "We fight Blackwood. Without him, the others fall." He released her shoulders and moved to look out across the ranch, the setting sun painting the landscape in fiery hues. "He will return with men tomorrow or the next day, expecting to find us packing to leave. Instead, he will find nothing." Margaret frowned, moving to stand beside him. "Nothing? You mean abandon the ranch after all?" Shadow Wolf shook his head. "Not abandon. Evacuate. Like smoke before the wind, we disappear, taking with us everything of value. The cattle, the horses, whatever can be moved. We leave Blackwood an empty shell to claim." Margaret's mind raced with the implications. Where would we go? How would we move an entire herd in less than 2 days? Shadow Wolf turned to her, the fading sunlight illuminating the determination in his weathered features. "To the high valley beyond Eagle Peak. Few white men know it exists. A hidden place with good water, sheltered from winter storms. My Apache brothers will help move the cattle tonight, using paths only they know." His hand found hers, a tentative touch that she didn't pull away from. "From there, we can strike at Blackwood himself, not his property or his men, but the man. Without him, his coalition falls apart." The plan was audacious, desperate even, but as Margaret considered their options, she realized it might be their only chance. The ranch buildings could be rebuilt, the land reclaimed, but only if they survived to fight another day. "Billy," she said suddenly. "He needs to be warned." Shadow Wolf nodded. "I will find him and send him ahead to the valley. Then I will gather my people." He hesitated, his hand still holding hers. "This path is dangerous, Margaret. I would understand if you chose another way." Margaret looked up at the man who had entered her life as a convenient legal shield and somehow become essential to her survival, perhaps to more than just survival. "There is no other way," she said firmly. "We go together." Something shifted in Shadow Wolf's expression then, a softening around his eyes that transformed his severe features. Without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead in a gesture so gentle it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Then we prepare," he said simply, releasing her hand and stepping back. "There is much to do before dawn." The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Shadow Wolf disappeared into the gathering dusk, returning hours later with 8 Apache riders who set to work immediately, gathering the scattered cattle with astonishing efficiency. Margaret, Billy, and Shadow Wolf packed only the essentials: food, weapons, tools, anything that could be carried on pack horses. The ranch house, which had been Margaret's home for 15 years, was stripped of personal items, but otherwise left intact. There was no time for sentiment, no moment to bid a proper farewell to the place that held so many memories. By midnight, the first group of cattle was already moving north, under the guidance of 4 Apache riders. Using hidden trails that wound through seemingly impassable terrain, Margaret worked through the night in a state of numb determination, pushing aside exhaustion and doubt. Dawn found her securing the last of the packs to a sturdy mule, her eyes burning with fatigue, but her resolve unshaken. Shadow Wolf appeared at her side, having overseen the movement of the remaining cattle. "It is done," he said quietly. "The herd is safely beyond the ridge, moving toward the valley. No tracks remain that cannot be mistaken for normal grazing patterns." Margaret nodded, too tired for words. Shadow Wolf studied her face, concern evident in his expression. "You should rest before we ride. The journey to the valley is not easy." Margaret shook her head stubbornly. "No, every hour we remain increases the risk. I'll rest when we're safe." Shadow Wolf didn't argue, recognizing the same determination that had first drawn his respect. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across what remained of the Sullivan Ranch, Margaret took one last look at the home she and Thomas had built together. The house stood silent and empty, the corrals devoid of livestock, the barn containing only what was too large or worthless to take. An eerie stillness had settled over the place, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Billy approached, leading their horses. "Everything's ready, Mrs. Sullivan, Mrs. Wolf," he said, his young face solemn beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Margaret smiled tiredly at the boy who had become like family. "Just Margaret, Billy. I think we're beyond formalities now." She turned to Shadow Wolf, who was scanning the horizon with watchful eyes. "Time to go?" Shadow Wolf nodded, mounting his paint horse with fluid grace. "Yes, we have perhaps 3 hours before Blackwood's men arrive, expecting to find us preparing to leave." He gestured toward the distant hills. "We will take the high trail through the Red Rocks. It is longer but safer from pursuit." Margaret swung into her saddle, adjusting her riding skirt and checking the revolver at her hip one last time. Billy mounted as well, leading the packhorse and mule on long reins. As they rode away from the ranch house, Margaret refused to look back. That chapter of her life was ending. But another, uncertain and dangerous, but somehow exhilarating, was beginning. Beside her rode the man who had transformed from a strategic alliance into something she had never expected to find again after Thomas's death. A partner, a protector, perhaps something more that neither of them had yet found the words to define. The journey to the hidden valley was arduous, following game trails that seemed to disappear into solid rock faces, winding through narrow canyons where they had to ride single file, ascending steep slopes that left the horses blowing hard. Shadow Wolf led with unerring confidence, occasionally stopping to confer with Apache scouts who materialized from the landscape as if by magic, bringing reports of the cattle's progress or warning of potential pursuers. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough to look back over the territory they had traversed. In the far distance, Margaret could just make out tiny figures approaching the ranch. Blackwood and his men, no doubt furious to find their quarry gone. "They will follow," Shadow Wolf said, reading her thoughts. "But they will find only false trails and cold camps." By nightfall, they will be chasing shadows in 3 different directions. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they crested a final ridge, and the hidden valley lay before them. A verdant oasis, nestled between towering cliffs, with a clear stream running through its center and rich grass covering its floor. The Sullivan cattle were already grazing peacefully under the watchful eyes of the Apache riders. Several hide lodges had been erected near a stand of cottonwood trees, smoke rising from cooking fires. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, taking in the secluded paradise. Shadow Wolf nodded, satisfaction evident in his posture. "My people have known of this place for generations. It has sheltered us in times of need. Now it shelters you as well." As they descended into the valley, Margaret felt a strange mixture of emotions: grief for what had been lost, fear of what was to come, but also a surprising sense of freedom, as if, in losing her ranch, she had somehow been released from invisible bonds she hadn't known were constraining her. That evening, seated by a small fire outside one of the hide lodges that had been prepared for her, Margaret finally allowed exhaustion to claim her. Shadow Wolf sat nearby, cleaning his Winchester with practiced movements. Billy had already succumbed to fatigue, snoring softly from inside the lodge. "What happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice quiet in the peaceful valley night. "Blackwood will not give up easily. He'll bring more men, perhaps even convince the territorial governor to send a militia." Shadow Wolf set his rifle aside, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "Now we become the hunters instead of the hunted," he replied. "Blackwood's power comes from his money, his connections, his reputation for invincibility. We will target these things one by one." He leaned forward slightly, the flames casting his features in sharp relief. "Tomorrow, while his men waste time searching for our trail, I will return to Willow Creek. There are things I must learn, people I must speak with." Margaret straightened, alarm cutting through her fatigue. "That's too dangerous. Blackwood will have men watching the town." Shadow Wolf's expression didn't change, but something warmed in his eyes at her concern. "I was moving unseen through enemy territory before Blackwood was born," he reminded her gently. "There are ways into Willow Creek that no white man knows." He hesitated, then continued in a more personal tone. "There is something else we must discuss, Margaret. Something I began to say before Blackwood's arrival interrupted us." Margaret's heart quickened, remembering the unfinished conversation in her kitchen that now seemed a lifetime ago. "Ness?" she prompted, when he didn't immediately continue. Shadow Wolf's gaze held hers steadily across the fire. "This marriage between us, it began as strategy, as convenience. But for me, it has become more." Margaret's breath caught at the simple confession. "More?" she echoed softly. Shadow Wolf nodded, his usual stoicism giving way to a vulnerability she had never seen in him before. "I have lived alone for many years, believing that path was the only one left to me. Then you came to my mountain with your proposal, and slowly, day by day, you have awakened things I thought dead within me. Respect, trust, caring." He paused, searching for words. "When this conflict with Blackwood ends, one way or another, I would ask you to consider continuing our partnership, not just on paper, but in truth." The request hung in the air between them, momentous yet stated with characteristic directness. Margaret found herself at a loss for words. A tumult of emotions swirling within her. Surprise, confusion, and beneath it all, a warmth she had not allowed herself to acknowledge until this moment. "I don't know what to say," she finally admitted. "I never expected this to become real." Shadow Wolf nodded, accepting her hesitation without offense. "There is no need for an answer now," he said. "We face dangers that may make such considerations moot. I speak only so you know where I stand, whatever comes next." He rose fluidly, picking up his Winchester. "Rest now. Tomorrow brings new challenges." As he turned to go, Margaret reached out impulsively, catching his hand. "Shadow Wolf," she said, using his name directly for one of the first times. "Thank you. Not just for this," she gestured around at the valley that had become their refuge, "but for everything."